Hi all, welcome back to the second of this week's screencasts. This is really just a simple sort of continuation of the first one, so we're just going to sort of jump straight in, as it were. But in the previous one, we looked at the first element of a 4Ps framework, that of power. And in this one, I really want to cover the next two here, which are peace and prosperity. So without further ado, let's just kind of jump in and move on to these two elements of this week's lecture material. So our next element of the US foreign policy framework is that of peace, and international peace in particular. Indeed, ultimately, much of what US foreign policy is about is the creation, maintenance and management of this, the management of international peace. Now, I suppose to a mind that only thinks about the here and now, or contemporary America, and judges the American past sort of through what we may call a sort of a Trumpian lens, or maybe the war on terror, this may perhaps seem like an odd statement to make. But from a sort of a wider historical standpoint, the pursuit of a more peaceful international system is a cornerstone of US foreign policy, and something we need to reflect upon really in the early stages of the module. Now, by and large, this is, I suppose, about American diplomacy, and it's true that the US has diplomatic staff all around the world which it uses on a daily basis during normal times. And in the past, it's enjoyed key and seminal roles in brokering peace, or acting as a peace broker, such as maybe the Camp David Accords of 1979, when President Carter, essentially got Egypt to sign a peace agreement with Israel, essentially removing Egypt from the Middle Eastern conflicts, as it were, and to create a more peaceful environment in the Middle East. We can maybe think about President Clinton's initiatives in the late 1990s, when he really was one of the key driving forces behind the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which essentially brought peace to Northern Ireland and the UK in a broader sense. It sort of made, it sort of led to the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, essentially agreeing to lay down its arms, as it were. As well as this sort of approach to diplomacy and peace, the US also has the option of employing sort of crippling economic sanctions on states which threaten to destabilize the international system. But I suppose for this week, and I suppose of course more broadly, what we're interested in here is that which we call international institutionalism, which best fits the liberal school of thought in theoretical international relations. In short, this really is about the creation of institutions that are set up in order to manage peace within the contemporary international system, which is usually in the US's interests. And for many of these institutions, the US has played a key and leading role in creating these institutions. Well, we know that the anarchy, or the anarchic nature that conditions much of international relations, cannot be eliminated, meaning that competition for resources and territory and interests generates significant tension between states. And this is one of realism's sort of timeless insights. Hence, we tend to take this as a given, and these tensions exist between both rivals and allies alike when it comes to international relations. Yet, over time, and certainly since the 1940s, the US has been instrumental in seeking a way to manage such tensions, and this really reflects the ideas of Immanuel Kant's seminal work, The Perpetual Peace, published way back in 1795, and I'm sure many of you will know this from studying international relations previously. Now, this in turn became the basis of a liberal school in international relations, of a liberal school of thought in international relations, and one that supposedly most democratic presidents tend to favour. Simply put, the assumption here is that the creation of international institutions such as the United Nations, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, along with the creation of democracies and greater international trade, may indeed help make the world a more peaceful place, as they provide a sort of open platform for discussion, debate, and sort of the creation of coalitions of states opposed to the aggression or the aggressive behaviour of others. And in many ways, this is essentially the principle of what we call collective security. And these sort of institutions help to reduce transaction costs of international relations and essentially promote mediation between disgruntled parties. And I suppose the seminal figure here, at least in the American context, and this is a figure we touched on briefly in the seminars last week, is Woodrow Wilson, who was the key driving force behind the push for the creation of a League of Nations way back in 1919. Now, as most of you will know, this was the precursor to the United Nations. But since then, most presidents, although not all, have been strong advocates of international institutionalism. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that the United States has been the primary driving force and creation behind so many contemporary international institutions that exist at the moment and certainly through to today. And these in turn have, I think we can argue, have created or contributed to the clear decline of interstate war since the 1950s, really since the United States embraced a global and world role. And as you can see on the slide here on the graph, relative to the historical past and since the ascent of American power, great powers really simply do not fight each other very much at all. And here we can see on the slide that from for going back hundreds of years, the sort of the incidence of great power war really was a norm of international relations. But from round about the mid 20th century onwards, this has been in almost terminal decline. We're now at the point where really countries don't fight each other at all, or great powers don't fight at all. And this essentially puts us in a period that we call the long peace, which has really since the 1950s, we've seen no wars between the United States and the Soviet Union. No nuclear weapons have been used in anger. No wars between great powers have existed, and no wars between European countries have taken place. And I think we can also say that no wars between the world's sort of developed powers have really broken out since this time. Now, of course, the US isn't the only sort of power and driving force behind this, but it is widely accepted that the US has played a critical role in all this. Okay, well, to sort of unpack this a little more, and broadly speaking, we may essentially think of 5 principal types of international organizations, and all 5 of these are listed on the slide here. Well, the first set we may think about are those that we may list as global security, such as the League of Nations or the United Nations, created in 1945. We may think about institutions that create regional security, such as NATO, created way back in 1949. We may think of economic institutions, such as the IMF, the World Bank, or the WTO, created far more recently in 1995. Fourth, we may think about international legal institutions such as the long-standing World Court and the International Criminal Court, which largely sort of took over from the World Court. And finally, we may think of institutions that sort of look at particular policy areas, such as the International Atomic Agency, created in 1957, which was essentially for nuclear non-proliferation, of a sort of a non-spreading of nuclear weapons. We may think about the WHO obviously playing an exceptionally important role today during the global pandemic. We may think of other elements such as the UN environmental programme created back in 1972. Now, in none of these cases has the US been the only state involved in establishing the organisation, but in most of these, probably all of them, the US has played a central and key role in their establishment. And although most of them are certainly imperfect, they are essentially, at least in an intellectual and academic sense, the realisation of the Kantian principles of international institutionalism. Now, many of these came to fore in the immediate aftermath of World War II, which saw the US firmly embrace a global role for the first time in its history, sort of shook it out of what was previously called American isolationism, the idea that the US didn't really want to get involved in the world's affairs. And this change in the US's policy shift from a broadly isolationist to a global leadership cannot be understated, and is a theme we'll return to in a couple of weeks' time. Of course, not all presidents like international organizations, as they constrain all powerful states to some degree, including the United States itself. But for the most part, they are prepared to work through these. Trump aside, and maybe we could think of George W. Bush here after 9/11 as those sort of presidents who have sort of reservations about working through international organizations. But nonetheless, most scholars now accept that the contemporary international system is far less dangerous, violent, and a sort of warlike environment than the eras before 1945. And this is in large part, I would argue, due to the organizations that the US has done so much to establish and create. And as such, we're now at a point in international history where interstate war is largely absent from international relations, even though global disagreements are sort of as strong as ever. And there is a linked report on the slide here on the screen. I think you'll have to go to the separate slides that I put up to get the hyperlinks to these, that talks through this, as does the there's a Tony Smith or a chapter by Tony Smith on the reading list this week, and he sort of talks through many of these sort of central themes. Okay, well, once we move past power and peace, the third goal of US foreign policy is to ensure the economic prosperity of the country and hence of America itself. In fact, for many scholars, and indeed for much of American history, the pursuit of economic prosperity was sort of the central facet of the country's foreign affairs. For example, James McCormick, in his 1992 work, American Foreign Policy and Processes. Yeah, sorry, I got that right. I had a slight moment there, just slightly rebooting. Sorry. But in James McCormick's work, he sort of demonstrates that during the 19th century, around 70% of all sort of treaties and international agreements signed by the US related to matters of trade and international commerce. Hence, I think we can't really think about the nature and the drive of US foreign policy without saying a few words on this, given the fact that there's so many international treaties are sort of directed towards commerce, trade, and essentially American prosperity. That said, I don't really want to spend too long on this theme in these screencasts. But I suppose a few points are worth stressing now. And first, I think it's to sort of avoid bankrupting itself in a similar way to that of the Soviet Union, or the way the Soviet Union did during the Cold War. It seems pretty self-evident that the US needs a fantastically strong economy to sustain such power in the international system. And as such, I think we can rightly stress American primacy is thoroughly dependent on a powerful US economy. And as you'll know, the US is the strongest economy in the world, with the IMF figures that I'm using here down on the slide. The IMF figures for 2020 putting nominal GDP of the US at round about 20.49 trillion, China at 13.4 trillion, and Japan at just 4.97 trillion. I say just, that's still a pretty astronomical figure. Now, of course, nominal GDP doesn't really just for prices, sort of a kind of basic element of economic measurements. But I suppose as a sort of base or a simplistic measurement of GDP, the US comes in first place here. I suppose if we use PPP or purchasing power parity, China looks stronger. But then again, if we go off GDP per capita, the US is stronger. There's a whole different way, a whole different sort of range of measuring these sorts of things. But I think if we just go off nominal GDP, we can still see that the US is exceptionally powerful in terms of its economy. If you're interested, take a look at the linked document on all this at the bottom of the slide here. If this sort of grabs your interest, and it talks through sort of these different ways of measuring the American economic lead in the international system today, and tells us much about just that raw strength of the American economy and the pursuit of American prosperity is a core goal of its foreign policy. Well, a second point worth noting on American prosperity is the novel nature of the American approach to economic foreign policy. Indeed, a central feature of US economic foreign policy has been the constant drive to erode what Woodrow Wilson, pictured on the slide here, called international protectionism, which in plain English essentially means getting rid of import tariffs on foreign goods, even if Donald Trump is trying to reverse sort of much of this and sort of go take America back to maybe an earlier time in its history. But until the 20th century, most governments essentially tried to protect their own domestic industries, and to do so, they essentially slapped sort of tariffs on foreign goods, or in other words, they put heavy taxes on foreign goods that made these imports essentially more expensive than local sort of domestic products. Yet at the end of World War I, President Wilson argued for the idea, or argued that the idea that goods and services should move across international boundaries without government interference, or he essentially argued for this, as the quote on the slide kind of stresses here. And this principle is known to us today essentially as free trade. Now, following this, and at the end of World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt, or FDR, was essentially a driving force, or a key driving force behind the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which we have again on the slide here. And this was essentially a multilateral agreement regulating international trade. And according to its preamble, or the kind of the opening statement of the agreement, its purpose was a substantial reduction of tariffs and other trade barriers, and the elimination of preferences on a reciprocal and mutually advantageous basis. In other words, the extension of free trade in globalized terms. Now, from this perspective, and given that the Soviet economic model during the Cold War, and sort of the nature of the implied closed markets and a command economy as directed from Moscow, the Soviet and economic models of the world were kind of simply incompatible during the Cold War, and of course this is one of those core tensions of the Cold War world. But after the Cold War, Bill Clinton essentially furthered this push towards global free trade. And this is really one of those kind of key driving elements of US foreign policy during the 1990s, after the Soviet Union has fallen apart. And this is that real push to open up global free trade everywhere. And one core element of this was the creation of NAFTA in 1993. Again, on the bottom of the slide, here the North American Free Trade Association, which is essentially a free trade area between the US, Canada, and Mexico. While Obama tried to, or Obama certainly did sign trade agreements with South Korea, Panama and Colombia, and was also kind of a strong advocate of free trade in areas such as the European Union. And as we know, Donald Trump maybe stands as a bit of an outlier here because he has slightly more reservations about this side of US foreign policy. Now, of course, we need to ask why the US favours this strong sort of emphasis on free trade as a central aspect of its foreign policy. Now, in theory, at least, and I must stress that in theory, free trade helps consumers in every country as it offers more choice in terms of goods at lower prices. So, for example, if Detroit can make better cars at lower prices, Detroit being a kind of a hub of, or a historical hub of US car manufacturing, consumers from San Francisco, Spain, and South Africa should be able to buy them at cheaper prices, largely because the production costs will be cheaper. Hence, once trade barriers essentially fall, each nation will gravitate towards the kind of industries that it can sort of best that it's best suited to, or from which it can best produce particular goods. So by this logic, the US will make fewer clothes and toys, since those industries will go to places with much lower wage sectors such as India, China, and the Philippines. However, Americans will find more markets for the things they do best, which is raising livestock, creating insurance products, making TV shows, film and music, high-end technological products, cars, and maybe, I don't know, some kind of new social media platform, as it were. But in a sense, everybody should essentially benefit from open markets and free trade. Now, of course, there are grave criticisms of this, what we need to sort of take on board here and sort of touch on. I suppose another perspective is that American foreign policy, when we think about it in these terms, becomes overwhelmingly concerned with serving the interests of capitalism, serving the interests of major banks and huge multinational corporations. As such, American prosperity is really for the benefit of special interests, as it were, and which can sort of lead to the exploitation of other countries and has kind of grave consequences, perhaps for American democracy. To continue this point, and as Bruce Gentleson goes on to write, the basics of this theory go back to the British economist John Hobson and his 1902 book, Imperialism. He carries on to writing, because the unequal distribution of wealth leaves the lower classes with limited purchasing power, capitalism creates the twin problems of underconsumption and overproduction. Thus, a capitalist system needs to find new markets for its products if it is to avoid recession and depression. Kind of the Bruce Gentleson work really is quite a useful one to get your teeth into. Now, for many academics, this logic leads to a form of economic neo-colonism or colonization and dependence, and this we see across Latin America and the US's relationship with the US, and is a point we'll maybe touch on as we move later on into the module and look at the US foreign policy in the 80s and certainly the 1990s. A second criticism of free trade, once coupled with American capitalism, is capitalism's constant need to expand and grow. Yet in doing so, capitalist countries essentially require access to inexpensive raw materials across the global south, and hence sort of retain an insatiable lust for iron, rubber, tin, food, copper, and indeed oil. And in many ways, this essentially robs countries across the world, and especially in the global south, it robs them of their raw materials, keeps them poor, and in many ways keeps them dependent on American goods and imports. And if we turn to the chap on the slide here, Vladimir Lenin, this was sort of a central argument and claim in his 1916 work, one of the ones he's best sort of known for, called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And here in this work, Lenin argued that once capitalism has had a chance to mature and develop, it not only drives US foreign policy in its need to open up markets everywhere, but it also means the systematic exploitation of other states and eventually leads to the establishment of American economic imperialism. Yet Lenin went further in his criticisms, and I think there is certainly something in his secondary claim here on this sort of capitalist thrust of foreign policy. And here he goes on to stress that such is the interlinked and close relationship between the capitalist classes and their utter stranglehold on the US's political institutions, that the US will never become a pure democracy, and that America's sort of foreign policy would never, well, I suppose would only ever really reflect the sort of the vested capitalist interest and never the American people per se. Okay, well, that's pretty much all I want to say on those two elements of American foreign policy in terms of international peace and prosperity, economics, and these sorts of things. So I'm going to wrap this up here now. But these two sort of twin ideas of prosperity and peace are really quite important to keep in mind as we progress through the module and sort of think about that, you know, not all US foreign policy is about that militaristic side of things. There is much more that's going on here, even though we will spend a lot of our time focusing on war, on conflict, and the Cold War and nuclear strategy and these sorts of things. But we do have one more screencast this week where we'll be looking largely at principles in US foreign policy, and then I'll say a few words about Robert Kagan's work. So take some time now to collect your views on what we've maybe spoke about here. Maybe go and grab another coffee or a tea, or go for a quick run or a climb or bouldering session, whatever it is you guys fancy. I always quite fancy a good climbing session after doing my screencasts. But whatever it is you do, make sure you move on to Screencast 3 pretty soon, where we'll be talking through, as I say, principles in US foreign policy. So until then, stay as usual, stay well, stay safe, and I'll see you all real soon for our final screencast of this week.